Under the Hawthorn Tree is set in Ireland in the 1840s during the famine. The story is about a family's struggle to survive when a countrywide disease wipes out the potato crop that poor people living in rural areas relied on as the main part of their diet. Field after field of potatoes had rotted in the ground. The novel features three brave young children, Ely, Michael and Peggy, who live in a rented one-room cottage with their mother and father. Times were tough for them before the famine, but now they were struggling just to keep alive. Many friends and neighbours had fallen ill from lack of food or had died from fever. Their father had left home to look for work, and the family were barely surviving on scraps of cornmeal, flavoured with any wild herbs they could find to mask the bland taste. Baby Bridget had become ill and died. Unable to provide a proper funeral for her, they buried her under a nearby hawthorn tree. Out of desperation, Mother decided she would have to go and look for their father, as they were out of food, had no money, and had nothing left to sell. After a few days of their mother's absence, even though Ely was taking extremely good care of them, they were all feeling hungry and lonely. One day, the landlord's caretaker came looking for them. He was there to tell them that they couldn't stay in the house on their own, and they would have no choice but to go to the workhouse. The three children were extremely worried. They couldn't bear the idea of being forced into a workhouse where they would be separated from each other and made to work long hours in horrible jobs. Reluctantly, they gathered what belongings they had and joined other poor souls on the journey to the workhouse, but with the real intention of giving them the slip and heading off across the country to try and find Castle Taggart and their great aunts, whom their mother had told them so much about. The children would face many difficulties and hardships on the way, but in a story of adventure, courage, and determination, they would never give up. The author of Under the Hawthorn Tree, Marita Conlon McKenna, explains to David Huntley what life was like for families during the famine.
Life at the time of the famine for children and families would have been very different from what we know of it, but it would have been so simple and very hard, very harsh conditions, living in a very simple cottage or cabin like this. Even in good times, there would have been very little food. It would have, maybe 1 or 2 meals a day if they were lucky. Their clothing, very little clothing, very rough clothing. They would have worked, they would have been expected to work to gather firewood, to gather fuel, to help with, if they had animals, to help on the farm. Very, very tough lives. And a lot of children died of not even the famine, but, just diseases. There were no inoculations, vaccines. And, if a family had 10 children, they'd be very lucky if they ended up with 4 or 5 children still living, So conditions would have been very hard. But they would have been happy in what they were doing because they didn't know any better. They didn't have TV, they didn't have contact really with the outside world. And they would have slept, very simply, gone to bed early, risen early to do their work and, the family meal. And neighbours were very important. Their socialising and fun was with the neighbours. They would have gathered their own turf for the fire, if they had a well, if not, to be trying to get water, maybe fish the odd time, but it would be very, very simple.
What about schools? Would the children have gone to school?
Some places they might have had schooling if there was somebody there to teach them, but schooling wasn't a guarantee. Okay. So some places there might be a schoolhouse or a person who was a learner who would teach a few children, but once they were old enough, they'd be expected to work. So once you hit about 12, you would not be expected to be learning or at school. You'd be out working.
Fairly near the beginning of the book, there's what would be described as a tragic sort of death in the family. I mean, the youngest child dies. If you can illustrate that, would you mind reading part of the book where that happens, because it's exceptionally moving.
This is the part that gets everybody really sad and upset, which, I suppose is a hard thing. No one slept. It was the early hours of the morning before the coughing stopped. Then there was a sudden silence. Mother was kissing the baby's face and each little finger one by one. God, let the sun come up soon. Let this terrible night end, the children begged. Suddenly they became aware of their mother's silence. They got up and went over to her. Large tears slid down her cheeks. She's gone. My own little darling is gone. Peggy started to cry. I want Bridget back, she wailed. I want her back. It's all right, Pet, assured Mother. She was too weak to stay in this hard world any longer. Look at her. Isn't she a grand little girl now? She's at rest. The baby lay still, as if she were just dozing. Mother told them to kiss her, and one by one they kissed the soft cheek and forehead of Bridget, the little sister they hardly knew. It's very upsetting even to read it now.
Yeah, I mean, what was it like writing that part? I mean, researching and writing it, and then deciding that, you were going to kill off one of these main characters so early in a children's book?
Well, the thing is, I was writing, I was setting out to write a story about the famine, and I just did not think it was possible to write a story to get people involved without someone, dying that was, partially a main person in the book. And I wanted my 3 children to survive, my main characters. And then this little sister, and I felt it was very important for, one of the children to be buried under the hawthorn tree. So baby Bridget became this thing. And the thing is, during the famine, and even without the famine, as I said, every family in those days, they would have lost small children and babies because with the conditions they were growing up in, but writing it, I remember I was so upset writing it because I had small children myself, and I cried, and so many teachers and people read it, said, oh my God, it's so sad, and teachers trying to control themselves reading it in schools. But something, I wanted, my readers, my own children who I wrote it for, to be affected, to be touched by this, to realise this is not a pretend story we're talking about. This is a real thing that's happened. And I'm not telling you a fairy tale. This is the worst thing can possibly ever happen to anybody or any family, to lose a child. And I wanted them to realise how serious this was and what a fight it was going to be for Eileen, Michael and Peggy then to survive, because this wasn't just happening in their cottage and cabin. This was happening in everybody's cottage and cabin around them and their neighbours. Villages were being decimated. People were abandoning their houses and going on the roads trying to find food and get work. So I wanted them to realise, this book, and parts of the book are light and the story does drag them on, but I really wanted to be very clear, like, you're going into the story, know what you're getting into. Even if you're only 10, this is what you're getting into, and care about these people.
I believe when you were researching the book, you came across quite a traumatic discovery about the hawthorn tree and about people burying children there.
Yeah, that's why I got, this whole thing came into the book, because I heard about this school down the country and they were taking a hawthorn tree out of this old field that they were going to drain and make a football pitch. And when they cut down the tree and they were taking the big roots out, there was a massive root system out under the tree, they discovered in the scoop in the earth, in the bucket of the bulldozer, 3 skeletons. And there was consternation as how these 3 skeletons and they turned out to be children, were buried under this hawthorn tree. No one knew had somebody just murdered children, a few years before and just buried them there. And the children at school were appalled, and the teachers and the whole, system, the authorities. But when they did bone density aging, they discovered they were 3 skeletons from the famine. They were very small, but people were terribly small in those days. And then during the famine, people, in the end, when it got really bad, they couldn't actually dig a grave because there was no men to dig a grave. There was no priest to do a funeral, and there was no coffins. No one could afford a coffin. So sometimes there were mass graves in a place, but in localities and small places, people would try to bury people themselves.
Do you think that people chose the hawthorn tree as being symbolic, knowing the Irish legend that surrounds it and that it was exceptionally bad luck to cut down a hawthorn tree, that this was perhaps a safe
Yes,
place?
I really am convinced of that myself, because I think anyone who grows up in the country and knows about the fairy tree and the hawthorn tree, and is most unlucky to even bring a branch of it into the house. And I think these were country people, and the superstitions, especially around that time, the 1800s, would have been very strong around rural Ireland. And I think they would have deliberately picked a hawthorn tree to bury a child under. to protect it.
You were very passionate about making sure that the publishers kept the title of Under the Hawthorn Tree. I mean, I believe they wanted to call the book something else.
They wanted to call the book something else, and I kind of, in the end, I had to put my foot down and insist on it. And luckily, my American publishers wrote in behind me and said, "Oh, we love the title of the book, don't change it." And I really think the book is really a lucky book. So many lovely things have happened around the book. And I think because, the child is buried under a hawthorn tree, in the actual book, and the story I heard about the 3 original children were buried on a hawthorn tree. And I have never done an interview where this has not come up in the discussion. And those 3 children, who I never knew their names, I don't know who they are, I don't even know what part of the country this happened, but people know about these children. Their death has not gone unnoticed, because so many people's deaths during the famine went unnoticed. No one knew who they were. They were in mass graves. They were never marked graves. They were nobodies. Lots of nobodies died because they didn't have anything,
Marita, thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, thank you very much. I enjoyed it myself. Thank you.
What did you think about Marita's book, Under the Hawthorn Tree?
I thought it was great, and there's loads of detail, and it's just a really, really good book.
Would it make you want to read any of her other books?
Yeah, it would.
What other books were hers do you think you'd like to read?
I think I'd like to read Fields of Home and just all the other books.
And I watched the video conference with Marita Conlon McKenna, and I really enjoyed it. I just love the way she doesn't act like she's famous and better than everybody else. She just acts like a normal person, and she really answers the questions with great detail, and I love her books.
We watched the video conference with Marita Conlon McKenna, and it was the most exciting thing that we've ever done in our school, for us and for the children. We had done a video conference before as a staff with the principal, Mr. Dorian, and a member of the South Eastern Board, but we'd never actually done anything like this with the children, and we'd spent the last week in preparation for questions and things that they wanted to ask. I've spoken to the boys and girls just now, and they've told me that the thing that they loved most was that they had a real live author in their classroom. It wasn't like she was on the TV, she was on the interactive whiteboard, it was like she was there. Now, we didn't get our questions read out, but all of them, our queries were answered by questions that had come from children from other schools, etc. They loved the fact that she was able to tell them what her writing meant to her, what inspired her to write Under the Hawthorn Tree. It was just an amazing experience. The children there were 55 children in one small classroom, and there were 6 adults, and nobody spoke. We just listened very carefully, and we enjoyed every minute of it thoroughly.
We're currently researching the topic of the famine, and through that we've decided to read and study Marita Conlon McKenna's book, Under the Hawthorn Tree. And I feel the strength of teaching the famine, the topic of the famine, which in itself is harrowing. Many people die. It's a tragedy, and children can't empathise, or I believe they can empathise better through a story. And the strength and how the book enriches the topic it's totally through the experiences of children. And for every new chapter, there's a new dilemma or a new challenge for the children. And my children have empathised with what the children are going to do. What will they do next? I hope I wasn't in that situation. I hope that it doesn't happen to me. And because it's children, they empathise more with the events of the famine. When we're studying the book, we certainly read to get into the heads of the characters and maybe see what the author intended. We have done much artwork. We will be, at the moment, setting up a video conference, or hoping to set up a video conference with another school in another part of the north. The school have already exchanged some letters to us or views to us, and they're very envious of the fact that we're meeting Marita Conlon McKenna today.